My wife's trained me well. She's a primary school teacher of year one, so it's a real challenging job. Thanks for joining us back after lunch. We'll crack on now with our next community practice workshop. So, as I mentioned this morning, we've got two this afternoon. So, insights will be now, and that's all about. It's a kind of a bit of a broad community practice, and it's all about that quantitative, qualitative data. What do we know? What are we finding out as we have different changes? So, and how can we put that into effect? So what does it actually mean for us? How do we interpret that kind of thing? So we thought on the basis of the conversations we're having tomorrow about human-centered design and digitisation, we needed a bit of a backbone of kind of economic outlook to contextualise everything that we're talking about. So what's the imperative? What should the focuses be on? What's changing in that economic environment? That leads us to make these decisions around digitisation, AI, but mostly how do we get back to human-centred design, knowing where we're trying to go. And as we talked about this morning, economic development strategy is kind of the backbone of a lot of what you're trying to achieve in your teams. So what can we understand to inform us in that space? So Trade and Investment Queensland have kindly offered to come along and give us some insights into what's happening in the Queensland economy and broader across the globe, and what does that mean, and what can we do locally. So I'd like to introduce Daniel Thatcher from TIQ to come and have a bit of a yarn.
Thanks for that. Obviously, what we need post-lunch is that real heavy macroeconomic view. So when I hear the snoring from the back, I know that I've won. And that everyone's ready for the afternoon. So I think the really important thing for this is, judging from the feedback from this morning as well, is we'll try and keep the conversation going, or maybe even try and start it as well for this session. So excellent, it does work. And also conscious of people online. Again, same as in the morning, if there's questions, they'll be picked up as we go. Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet today, and from those where the online participants are dialing in from, to acknowledge elders past, present and future, and to acknowledge any First Nations people in the room. In terms of myself, my name's Dan Thatcher, Director of Strategy and Performance for Trade and Investment Queensland. We'll come on to what TIQ's role is in a bit, but in terms of myself, I spent about 15 years working for customs in the UK. So as I said, I tried to stop things coming in. I then had a bit of a left turn when I was offered the option of stay in London or come to Brisbane and the Gold Coast to support the Com Games in 2018. It wasn't a hard choice. What I would say is I love the place so much, moved lock, stock and barrel over and stayed. What a wonderful state. So that's a bit about me. Again, just to reiterate, in terms of the session itself, as we go through the slides, we'll just try and break it up on each one and just see whether it resonates with people, what your experiences are, and we go from there. All right, so bearing in mind that everyone's had lunch, I thought we'd do a mini quiz. Yep, that's as good as I thought it was going to be. All right, we'll see if we can do better as we go through it. 1 in 5 jobs relates to what across Queensland? 1 in 5 jobs is supported through trade and export, but 97% relates to what? Correct, 97% of businesses in Queensland are small. That's the highest proportion of any state in Australia, which when we talk about what that means for Queensland as a global state, and in terms of our footprint, it's always worth bearing in mind what genuine capacity and capability there really is. 43rd largest global economy is Queensland's economy, equivalent to Hong Kong's, for those who want to place it in context. 1/3 of the state's GSP relates to, there is a theme to this, trade. Supports 1/3 of the state's GSP. Now, the 4 out of 10, any ideas? 4 out of 10 of trade-related jobs are in regions. So when we talk about the importance of regional engagement, TIQ is a statewide agency. Yes, the HQ is in Brisbane, but we have a network that covers across Queensland. It's why I think events like this are so important, because 40% of those jobs that trade supports are actually outside of Brisbane. Something we should all remember, I think. Probably talk about a bit more. And the last one, 1 in 10 jobs. So we've dealt with trade, so it's not that. It is in the title of TIQ. It's not the Q and it's not the T. There we go. It's investment. One in 10 jobs within the state is directly supported through foreign investment. So when you put that package together alongside 97% of businesses being small, the criticality of trade and investment to Queensland's economic health just underplays, I think, all of it. So that's a bit of a contextual piece, I guess, and a desperate bid to wake people up after lunch. 5 out of 10, but it's a start. That one's not a stat. All right, so about TIQ, this is one of the more dull slides that our comms team does like us to cover. Is this recorded? It's the last time my CEO sends me anywhere, isn't it? So, here is TIQ, where you can read for yourselves. What I would say is we don't charge a fee. You pay for that anyway. We kind of do through people's tax contributions, I guess. But we're free at the point of access. Unlike Austrade, not that we should be competitive, but we don't charge. We are the state's global business agency. It is our job to support people to export, irrespective of size, and to seek foreign investment. What we do try and do is to deal with export-ready businesses. We're beginning to move into the space where we support some of the work through partners around helping people become export-ready. But the key point for us is we really want to get those people export-ready and go from there. So again, I'm not just going to read off the purpose and vision. You can read it for yourselves. But it's on the other side of the screen that I will touch on a little bit more. TIQ is in year 2 of a 10-year funded strategy. So it's called the Queensland Trade Investment Strategy, which kind of does what it says in the tin, really. And we'll cover the details of it a bit more. But there's 4 main elements, which are so simple that even I can remember them and actually understand them, which from a strategy perspective, I think is quite good, actually. You should see what we started off with. Doesn't look like this. This is much better. Promote Queensland. It always surprises me about how nervous government gets around this. I went to a talk. It was Cindy, who at that point was the lead around 2032. And she was out sort of engaging people, talking about Brisbane, talking about the States. And in the end, everyone met her with, sorry, where? What really stood out for me from that feedback is, on a global picture, Queensland doesn't resonate. Brisbane certainly doesn't, compared to, say, Melbourne and Sydney. If you haven't got neighbours, a bridge or an opera house, you're in a bit of a struggle. So I guess for me, when I sort of first came over here, from the UK's perspective, yeah, there's local councils, but it's not a state-driven thing. And obviously here we've got the states and local councils. So one of the key jobs of Queensland and one of the key jobs of TIQ is actually to deal with Queensland as Queensland and try and put that on the map. Obviously, 2032 is a multi-generational opportunity, but it is a chance for us to actually establish ourselves as a place to live, work and stay. I didn't come up with that. It's far too slick. Boost exports. Again, it says what it is on the tin. We'll talk about what we actually export in a minute, which is pretty bloody simple, really. We kind of dig it and put it on a boat. But the picture around that is much broader, much more varied and really dynamic. And there's a lot in there that we really need to celebrate, grow, and it links to the first point, really. Grow investment and jobs. This one, again, we'll touch on it as a bit of a link when we come back to things such as COVID, which is really what people want to talk about after lunch or during lunch, as I managed to do. But one of the key things for Queensland is we have a really small service sector. We'll talk about a bit what it really constitutes. It doesn't actually take that long because it's really only 2 main parts. But one of the key parts of TIQ there is around securing that investment, particularly around value-add industries, which sounds like a great government thing, doesn't it? But if you think about it, what drives connectivity in terms of airlines, head office locations? We have a significantly lower proportion of that than other states. So there's some real practical things that we need to focus on when we're talking about how you take a big economic picture and channel that down into what are we targeting. That's one of the themes that we'll come back to. Trusted partner. I'll be honest, obviously coming from a customs sort of background, sort of freight trade side of it's kind of been in my bones for quite a while. That interesting. But linked to that, I'd say is, if TIQ at a state level doesn't talk about trade and investment, there aren't that many people who are. There's a lot of focus on internal economies. There's a lot of focus on domestic investment. One of our jobs is to actually inform the DP about what the trends are, what is happening, to get out to events like this and not just always talk at, but hopefully talk with and to listen in terms of what's going on across those regions. So that's what that trusted partner thing is. And when we come back and talk about how we package up some of the insights, that really is part of our role, is to try and help not just government, but the clients and councils that we work with understand what is going on out there, but in a way that kind of makes some sort of sense. So that's the strategic pillars. Does that make sense? I don't think anyone's going to say no at this point. That might come later. I promise not to tell the comms team if you do. All right. It was quite a broad brief. So the last thing that anybody here wants probably is for me to talk for 90 minutes. I'd love that. You really wouldn't. So again, we'll try and break it up, but there are just a couple of introductory slides to go through. Again, I'm not going to touch much on this, but I'll start at the bottom, which is, Christ, if anyone says we're from the government and here to help, most people will exit out the door. But I would start on that point as I kind of ended the presentation, which is we are a service that is free at the point of access. We are here to generally help clients. And I think from a Queensland government perspective, and I know there's some great colleagues here as well from other parts of Queensland government, which is fab. The bits that I really resonate with is where that actually involves clients. So our job is to work with businesses and help them support and grow. That to me has real value to it. So on that one, I think we put our money where our mouth is, which is our network of client officers. Similarly, we are TIQ's global business agency. We have an offshore network in 16 markets that is accessible for all Queensland, government, councils, or whoever. Every year, our commissioners come back into market during what we call a QTIP program, the Queensland Trade and Investment Program, and they do get out and about. And that is, frankly, when you speak to them, that's their best part of the year, or the best part of that program anyway, because they're back out to see what Queensland's got. Key to that is how people in this room connect with our regional networks. I think there's a good spread. I haven't quite managed to get around everybody who's here yet, but if you haven't managed to connect with them, give us a shout, and we can just make sure we put you through to the right part of that contact group. So that's kind of the strategy, ambitions, and principles. But I guess I'd say on that one, kind of is what it is. But the point I'd just pull out there probably is around the diversify piece. And again, it's going to be a bit of a theme that we'll come back to throughout. So that's probably the introductory stuff. He says, and then lies. So I guess on this one, in terms of my team, it's a broad team that we run, but the core of it is about how we take external information, package it up to drive TIQ and inform Queensland government, and then how we use internal information to continually improve the services and our performance. Does anybody here, I presume everyone here's got similar functions buried in different parts of the organisations? Anybody work in those? Is there another geek in the corner like me? No. Oh no, everyone's here in real jobs. Crap. Yeah, excellent. Always good to find one fellow. But what's the points that I'd like to make on this is, I don't know how people feel about this, but there is more data to digest than there ever has been. Now, part of my background in strategic intelligence was how you go from data to intelligence. And I actually feel that challenge has got exponentially bigger. And for the businesses that you work with, I'm really interested in terms of what they're saying in this sort of area. I don't do that awkward pause and then no one says anything. But again, jump in if and as you want. But from my view, part of this presentation is a bit of a personal journey from how our team has begun to do this. TIQ would be bigger than 80% of the firms that you work with. But in terms of Queensland government, we're like the sort of, I guess, small toenail on the foot sort of thing. We're a very small part of what Queensland government is. But our job, the two-person team in this area, is to look at that global environment and package it up. And that's, again, we'll touch on how we do that. I guess one of the slides begins to talk about how we actually use AI in a safe and intelligent way. And I'm kind of intrigued as to people's experience in that one as well. So that's kind of, the principles for how we operate. I guess, we kind of touched on the regional networks and the other services we provide. We do provide insight newsletters. I hate LinkedIn. I struggle with it. Hate's too strong a word. I get told off. I struggle with LinkedIn, but a lot of our insight work gets put up there. So there's free resources and accessible resources for people here. Hopefully our networks can augment each other. And again, that insight is trying to bring that down in a way that actually makes sense for people. To keep it relatively simple, within TIQ itself, we have a suite of data tools. I'm sure people hear things like Grail, the state government's sort of data service, groups such as RemPlan, how we use our own CRMs. Again, what more could you want to talk about after lunch than how we use a CRM effectively? That would really keep us going. Wait till we get to drinks. But in a small organization, the importance of your own customer information is the lifeblood of everything that you do. And if your CRM is the same as ours, making cohesive decisions out of that, I think it's an opportunity, not a challenge. It's an opportunity to do it better, or it's a bloody nightmare. The other piece in there as well, as we'll come back to, is around AI. So that's our sort of broad approach to what we do. It's quite a small team. There's 10 in total covering everything that we do, which actually makes it quite big when you speak to a small business and they go, that's bigger than a whole organization. So those conversations resonate as well. All right, on to the meat of it. In terms of one of the first things I did when I moved into this role is every year, TIQ, we always said we placed the clients at the heart of what we did. So we surveyed all of those clients who we'd supported to an export outcome to say how great we were. And then we put that back into our statements back to Parliament to say, hey, look, 90% of our clients on investment think we were great. 86% of our export clients were satisfied with the free service that we provided. So we were actually using client information not to improve how we operate, not to place the client or the human at the center of how we work, but to validate what we were doing. Now, again, I don't know what sort of client information that people here harvest. For me, that's kind of missing the point of this. So one of the first things I introduced was, do you know what? That's great. It's important to speak to the clients that we support, and it's important to get that information in a way that we can package back up to our superiors to make sure we get the funding that we need. Get that. What's even more important is that we speak to exporters and investees across Queensland, irrespective of whether they work with us or don't. So what did we really find out? We find out that 56% of people engaged, there's around 500 businesses that were spoken to, were aware of TIQ. I actually think that's really positive. So what we're beginning to do here, and again, I'm really interested in terms of how you, there's some good examples here from the tables around how you engage with your clients, whoever they are, internal, external, because tomorrow there's a lot of work around centered design. And client and human center is really key to it. So what did that tell us? If you're glass half full, well, 50% just above are aware of TIQ. That's pretty good. It also means that 50% of those aren't, which as the state's premier trade investment agency, if trade's going to be the lifeblood of what we do, there's a huge opportunity there. There's a huge outreach that we can do. Are we just working with businesses that we already know? Who is out there that we can actually go out and access? What came up then? Not just about how good services were, which was very positive, but what were people looking for at this point? And it wasn't hugely surprising, I guess, when we did it. But these are consistent themes anyway. What are the concerns? Well, top three, freight supply chain and freight availability. And we'll come on to some of the long-standing changes that have come out of that through COVID. But the key bit for me was actually when we talk about placing the client at the center of what we do, it's not that validation that we're doing a good job. It's to actually go out and objectively speak and get that insight. And then what matters, and I'll just flick on to the next slide for a bit, is what you actually do with it. So from that, we stood up a very small freight service within TIQ. So we've now got a freight analyst on board whose job is to map out precisely what is going where, what those freight linkages are, and what came out of that, some of the work that that third of a person does, is some of the key things for Queensland. Now, and I will pause after this one, I keep saying that, so ideally when I do that, we won't go through that awkward moment But because one of the key questions I've got of this organisation, it's one of those we talked about in action-orientated outcomes, is for yourselves collectively in the room, how well do you understand the supply chains and the logistics for which your communities and which your businesses operate? If 1/5 of your businesses are involved in trade, no, hang on, that's slightly wrong. 1/5 of jobs, sorry, are involved in trade. There is no trade without transport. So what does this actually show us? Beneath this, what you'll see is that states such as Victoria and New South Wales post-COVID, their post-COVID recovery in terms of airline passengers is about 120, 130% of where it was pre-COVID. Queensland tells a good story because we say, hey, we're up to around 90% of recovery. That's actually quite a gap when you think about it. So what we've seen is there are now fewer airlines operating in Queensland post-COVID to fewer airports than there were before, when there's actually more capacity built in different states. I won't mention bird flu yet because I've been told to be quite cheerful. But what does that mean? Not that I was at lunch. It's the real Dan. Never let the Englishman speak. But what does that actually mean for us? Well, post-COVID, for our clients, there is a structural change for how Queensland operates logistically. What does that mean? It means this Queensland leakage, this is freight in terms of its export value that is shipped outside of Queensland. So this stuff now, 161 million of exports for the US, instead of going out, say, through the Toowoomba hub or going out through the freight centre that there is at Cairns, Christ, even through Brisbane, they now drive past Brisbane and go to Sydney. Most of our clients wouldn't actually know that because they just use the freight forwarder that they've always got a relationship with. So one of the questions I'd ask of people in the room is when we're speaking to exporters or small businesses is, do you understand where your goods actually leave? Do you understand where your supply chains are coming in from? Because we've all seen what happens in that vulnerability when, we'll never shut internal borders. We did. We'll never shut external borders. You wait till they get on geopolitical tensions. I can go all day. But, for this to me is how we as TIQ have taken quite a loose piece of customer feedback, but the commonality of those top 3 themes was our clients telling us they're really concerned about this and they're not getting the help and information that they need. We can't solve it. We don't have the levers. I mean, one of my team was up last week. There's actually a freight forwarders conference in Cairns last week. I don't know if anybody here went to that. I'm sure it's unmissable. But he found it genuinely groundbreaking. And it's the first time, and Ben Alexander from Cairns is fantastic. He's ex-airlines. He's really engaged in this. TIQ is now in the room with those freight forwarders to try and understand what drives them. And they're not really aware of this as well, because their predominant factor, quite rightly, is just price. So through that structural change that we've had since COVID, we've now built in sort of strategic risk to Queensland's trade picture, particularly when you put commodities to one side, where you're talking about what is quite a small group of high-end exporters, which makes up our non-commodity base, very dependent on how they get their goods out. So I'll pause there. The only thing I'd say, again, that's another lie because I'm going to say something else, is what really strikes it for me is United States and Hong Kong. So we're talking primarily here by air. For Hong Kong, that is the world's biggest airline freight hub. And we have stuff leaving Queensland to get to that. The second biggest, by the way, is in the US. So the top 3 of our markets by leakage have 2 of the biggest hubs at the receiving end. Similarly, for the US, we've celebrated quite recently a number of new air routes coming into Queensland, and we'll touch on this around services. I'm not trying to scare anybody. I promise this is supposed to be much more uplifting. But the key bit of that is those planes are leaving with 50% of their cargo empty. Airlines now make decisions on air route validity within a year. Tipping points now in terms of only about 15% of their profit is around trade. 15% is critical for those airlines staying put, which is so key, not only to get international students in, but to get our goods out. So one thing, again, in terms of the action-orientated parts of this is making sure that we try and understand the nature of what is such a key, I guess, enabler for that trade picture for all of us, and how we engage with this and speak to our businesses around it. So I will pause at that point. I promise. These are quite hard questions to ask a group, really, aren't they? So I guess I kind of pause and just say any sort of reactions or thoughts to what I've just kind of raced through there, or not raced through, it must feel like. I mean,
in terms of, say, our grade,
yeah,
there's obvious things that impacted our capacity to export, losing Cathay Pacific in 2019. So the leakage here, so that is what's leaking out of
state,
state, say going out of
Sydney,
for example.
Yeah.
Behind that, obviously, you know, it's an obvious one why we are losing our export capacity. I was under the impression that a lot of it was going to Brisbane, South Centre.
Okay. I mean, some of it, don't get me wrong, sorry, that's grossly simplistic. Some of it would stop off at Brisbane because it's a bigger hub and there's an economy of scale there. But if you're with BAC, they would talk about, you know, their main competitor. That's why genuinely there's a recent session with all airlines, TUQ, and obviously you've got the shipping stuff's even less transparent. But a lot of this is all about stuff leaving the state, and predominantly it's Sydney. Why is during COVID, when airlines retracted, they really went back to where the core of that volume was, the passenger volume. So that meant that for Melbourne and Sydney, they're a little bit more insulated than we were in Brisbane. Certainly than we were more than in Cairns. The whole thing just exponentially increases, really, I guess, doesn't it, as you spread out?
Yeah.
But it means when we talk about having normalised post-COVID, the new normal, is actually quite different to what was, and it's got a real direct impact on our traders.
So essentially, there's been efficiency made during that period, and now trying to step back.
And what you've now got is the freight forwarders having relationships perhaps where they didn't have, so they're now bedded into, and this isn't negative intent or any of it. They now might have an existing relationship, say, with Sydney, as perhaps they were working with Brisbane or perhaps with Cairns. When an airline now, say, a Cathay, makes the decision to come back, they need not just a passenger cap to be up sort of 80-85%. They need the freight utilisation to be at sort of, again, 70-80%. And we're not at that. And most traders wouldn't know. Because why would you? Why would you ask the question, how's this stuff leaving the state? So again, in terms of like, and I'm terribly sorry, it's a question at the back as well.
We had the freight going up coming in because it came through Sydney and not through Queensland, and then freight going up coming out as well. So
yeah, and that's not unusual. Manufacturing's often in the same boat as well. What we haven't put on here is Queensland does get a little bit in from other states, like gold from NT and WA, but it's not like for like in terms of value, because the supply chains, when you look at things such as tier 2 and tier 3 emissions potentially coming in as well. So anyway, really valid point. Thank you. Any other sort of thoughts and reflections before we cheer everybody up? I promise not to come back. But no, so I guess in terms of action orientated bit, for me, it surprised me how little we talk about this, being honest. That's why, you know, I'll be the one in the corner at the drinks, but it really does enable a lot of the economic success of the state. So I think we need to recognise it, and, you know, just the more we talk about it and understand it, the easier it is to put our arms around it and try and do something, I think. Even if it's just those practical conversations with our small businesses, just making them aware to ask the question with the freight forwarder, out of interest, mate, where's the stuff going out from and where's it coming in from? Because we'll talk about supply chain resilience in a bit. So that's the cheerful subject of freight. Okay. Now, one of the taskings of the team, and I think, again, it came from the client survey, which I'm actually not going to apologise for. It really does and should give a mandate for what is quite a new team. Because what that survey was saying is the one-to-one support that TIQ offers is great. But the picture and the requirement to support beyond that, we need services that you can scale up. And you can't just solve that with people. It is a people-related business. And we've talked about how you do effective digitalization. So that's not replacing the one-to-one. I'm the person who sees a chatbot, swears at the screen, and then tries and finds a phone number. So, you know, I'm far off the other end of the scale here. But there's a raft of information and products that is suitable to digital delivery. And part of that as well is how you then help the right people and use that one-to-one resource in the right way. And that's not just management talk, that's crucially important because we can't just keep putting more people in. No one can, sadly. So what's this about? What people are trying to ask TIQ is, from a trade perspective, there seems to be so much happening. How do we begin to, where do we even start? So thankfully, we employed a couple of really bright people. And I said, where do we really start? And we began to draw out what that picture looked like. And we actually came up with 5 themes. And what I found really quite reassuring is we did a lot of external challenge on that. But when I keep reading stuff from McKinsey or Deloitte, it is broadly consistent. But the value add here from TIQ, and again, I'm interested in the conversations that you're having with the people that you talk to and support, is what does that mean for Queensland? What do we actually need to be thinking about? So what are these sort of 5 themes? Well, uncertain global economy. I mean, all you got to do is read it. Look at the news. And it's almost impossible. One thing that I think is really helpful is it's really hard to separate them out. But when I was on the flight on the way up, eventually, what I found really unhelpful was it was impossible to separate them all out because they all link. So when we talk about the uncertain global economy, what does that really mean? Well, we talk a lot about diversification. Post-COVID, during COVID, Japan emerged as Queensland's key trading partner. Over the last year, China's now Queensland's largest trading partner. So as China's reopened, our businesses have migrated more that way or migrated back. That's not a bad thing. It's a really important market for the state. No one's ever denied that. But if we're learning things about not putting all the eggs in one basket, to use that really technical term, have we learned? Are we having those conversations with our clients about, yeah, that's great. But if you've established a relationship over here, because capacity is key with a state of 97% small businesses, we often can't service more than, say, 1 or 2 markets. Frankly, we can often only service the domestic, and you could be an exporter, that's an incidental one. So there's a conversation to be had there about don't neglect the markets that you've been great in. That's excellent. But if you built new relationships, how do you generate that capacity and capability to meet the requirement of both? Bearing in mind, we don't want to be in a position if something else happens, and we'll get on to Taiwan in a bit and we'll probably stop recording at that point. How do we just be smarter? Not smart is the wrong word. How do we try and balance this off just that little bit more? And we can go into a bit more detail if we want. So that's kind of one of those bits. And in terms of the action-orientated bits, it's, again, just those conversations. Sometimes people aren't even aware that their goods are exported, which is completely fair because it can go to a wholesaler and end up in different markets. The conversations you hear from clients when they're, I don't know, say in China and Shanghai, and they see their product in the market and they're like, how did that get there? But it's the understanding, again, of where it's going and being conscious of trying to service more than one, if possible. Geopolitics. Maybe we will save this one for about 6:45 on the drinks. But again, all you got to do is, I don't know, for those, just look at the news. It's a pretty interesting time, isn't it? I think it's fair to say. I'm not going to go political, but I think one of the things that will show in a future slide is if we talk about nationalism or populism, which we are seeing more of, what does that actually mean? If you look at the number of trade barriers, and I might actually just, this isn't mine, so I'll probably stab the wrong screen. So maybe we'll just jump to it. And again, pause and I'll ask the questions. On this side, the red, what that shows is the number of trade barriers in existence since, hang on, highly technical here, glasses, 2010. But there's more trade barriers now than there was at the end of World War II. So what you saw was a huge period of globalization with countries working together. Easier to get goods out, easier to get stuff back in. What we're seeing now, and China's obviously got a big impact, particularly 16 onwards. It's not just China. The key jump here happened during Trump's presidency, being honest, and what America set. No state's independent. Obviously, one of Australia's advantages is that key economic partnerships and deals that we have with the US, that there's always risks and opportunities within that. What does that mean in terms of our role as TIQ? Well, actually, I'm presuming all of us love a chat about a free trade agreement, but actually what they are and what they present in terms of an opportunity is crucially important. If someone had told me a year ago that TIQ and my team would be hosting the Australia Prawn Association for a session on market opportunities to the UK, I wouldn't have thought that that was something that we'd be doing. Why are we doing that? It's because when we look at the Australia, UK, not Australia, EU, that one's not there, but the UK, thanks to decisions made, is outside of that scope. So actually, one of the things that they're moving towards now is a relaxation of what those barriers look like around seafood. That is likely to be in Australia's advantage. So in terms of those engagements that we have with our clients, one of the questions I'd have for people in this room is, how can we as TIQ support you with that, to understand what these are horrendously complicated things? How can we package that up to help you have those engagements with clients? This relates back to, how do we begin with small businesses to try and shape them towards opportunities that frankly they may not know, that aren't actually there yet, may or may not happen, think they will. And each hour we have with those businesses is an hour that's taking them from their core job. What does that look like in terms of success? So I don't know, from the conversations that you've had, are you getting feedback about the sheer complexity of doing business on a global scale? Is that a theme? And
Yeah.
nodding heads, any
Yeah.
comments just to break my voice, the monotone? Please, save me from me.
So in my position at Renew, I have a small business that has scaled up quite considerably.
Yeah.
It's a handmade product, and he's managed to get the Australian made logo,
Yeah,
all
great.
of those things. He's now selling, he has an exclusive trade agreement in Taiwan. He's stocked in Singapore in raffles. But to get him there to understand his export obligations as a small business, to scale up from what was literally an old hotel lobby shop front all the way through, we had to find private mentors who had done all of these things before to explain what these trade agreements were and how he was going to ship a perishable product to somewhere like China. What are the testing requirements when it gets there, when he says it's not tested on animals here? And so I'm curious, would you guys ever have the capacity to go that small, to really have those packages to help people understand where there are services to educate them through the process without having to go to individuals who have done it themselves?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is yes and no, being honest. I actually think we probably do too much of that at the moment, on the basis that if you're part of our network, you're in. It doesn't really matter how big or small you are.
Yeah.
We've got that relationship, and I'm being really open and really challenging of ourselves as everybody else here. So if we knew who that client was, they might be on our books. We probably are going the extra mile with them. But when we talk about digital design, I'll be honest, where we're trying to get TIQ to is to a point that actually we don't need to do that. We would actually have some really good tools on our website that would actually make sense to someone who's trying to do this on top of a really busy running a business. We're not there yet. And again, when I talk about digitalization, that's not about making it harder for people to get the services that you need. It's not like dealing with Telstra or sorry, take that back. They're really good. But you get the point, don't you? This stuff should be packaged up in a way that our website and services need to be as good as leading private sector ones. So we've been going through a process of beginning to steer ourselves to that. And some of my team's looking at what services look like. The other piece is our trade advisors do have access to a tool called Market Finder, and that takes the STC code, the trade code, and you can plug that in against the individual market, and that will pull out what those barriers and regulations are, and it kind of pumps out this quite good report. But I'll be honest, one of the challenges that we've had as an organisation is to upskill our trade officers to become more digitally literate. So quite a lot of those trade officers then come to someone in my team and say, hey, could you use that thing? And we're like, well, actually, we've helped you out 8 times. It's probably your job now. So we're going through our own sort of capability piece. So really long answer to your question, but we don't turn anyone away that's dependent on size, but we're limited by the people we've got on our current services. But if you know them, connect them in with Ben and Co. And part of this is to say, ask them to do a Market Finder report, because that will help them from their trade code to understand against the different markets, to try and then understand what they're looking at, as opposed to getting halfway through and then going, oh, Christ, I needed to do that. I thought I was here and now I'm back here, which is really frustrating for them.
I think that digital thing's fantastic, because the issue of time for small business a lot of the services that already exist through government are 9 to 5, Monday to Friday.
Yeah.
And the majority of the small businesses that I'm helping capacity build are 11 o'clock at night on a Saturday.
Yeah, and
when they're trying to do their paperwork, and they lose momentum because they can't ask us a really simple question. And if it was all online and digitized,
they can pull it down when they'd
actually have those resources when they needed them at their availability.
And that's one of the challenges I've been saying is we still like then let's do an export readiness. So that's a workshop that we have to get everybody in a central location for a day. Well, if there's 2 people in a business, that's not particularly helpful. Sometimes it's 1, so they're in effect offline. Translating that to something that's not just more scalable, but that means more accessible. So this is where we need to be better in terms of the services we provide for smaller businesses. Sorry, mate, I think you.
This might be a bit too vexed to deal with quickly, but is there a rub between the free trade agreements, which, as you point out, is in the interest of many of our industries, particularly regional industries, and some of the procurement policies that government puts in place? You know, the Buy Queensland, and we'll put a weighting on it if it's painted maroon. We'll put a weighting on it, particularly if it's manufactured in Queensland. How does that rub against free trade agreements where you know?
I mean, being honest, it's why there isn't one. There's much more. Yes, you look at things like the EU.
Yeah.
I think that's why these things are so hard
Yeah.
to do. It's also, if you talk about, and, you know, one area you talk about trusted business advisor is we're working heavily with the First Nations business community. Sadly, closing the gaps is real for First Nations exporters as it is for the communities and, you know, the economic position that they're in. When you look at what is counted as genuinely as a First Nations owned business, it's very different to when there's sometimes a veneer put over something. So you're right, it is really complex. I'd have said that one of the, in terms of the trade side of it and the agreements, one of the complexities is if you look at the US and if you're into, when you begin to talk about ITARs, one of the key things that has come out, so that's the trade agreement around arms. A lot of people, in terms of value add, a lot of it would be defined as dual use. You might not even know that when you're developing it. What we're seeing through AUKUS is ITARs might be removed for Australia. That would be a huge step for not just defence related companies, but for those, and, you know, even you talk about space or dual related. So things like that can have a real practical impact as well. And people don't know what they don't know. So it's great. So was there someone? No, I was just hoping. All right, I'm going completely the wrong way, but that does give you a clue that it's not too much left, which is probably good news. Coming back to this, just when you thought you'd come out of the doom and gloom, and it's not doom and gloom, because within each one of these, and there's that classic risk opportunities piece. So you look at the geopolitics, but the importance of Japan there being then brought in as an AUKUS partner. What does that mean for our clients? Is Japan would be it really doesn't have a defensive infrastructure. So, you know, if I was doing this in Townsville, you look at the capability and capacity that there is up there. Actually, some of these things have a direct opportunity for the businesses that we operate with. How do we then help people understand that and access that? Supply chains, probably covered enough about that. I will touch on the budget later, so it's something to look forward to, no doubt, and the highlight and lows on that. But I guess my overriding point on that is post-pandemic, however we're supposed to phrase it, the new normal has some benefits for Queensland, but there's some real strategic risks in that as well that we've talked about. Balancing energy, I guess, and again, there's things in this happening overnight where there was the announcement around EU and Australia around critical minerals. There are things happening here every day now around critical minerals, renewable energy, that sort of recognition, I guess, that energy transition, which feels all the way up here, doesn't it, in terms of how you talk about it. But, you know, primarily for a commodity fueled state, this is probably one of the key questions that's going to impact on everybody, and how we then cope with all the related different tiers of emissions and how we begin to factor that in, how we access government procurement chains when that sort of element and ESG becomes even more important for a small business that, frankly, we're actually quite carbon heavy. Even in industries like even food and ag and things like that, we're seeing amazing innovation and people are now leaning in and solving it themselves. But there's probably opportunity in that as well, because if you look towards Southeast Asia, the opportunity for that sort of service related side is probably an area that we haven't really even begun to explore and access yet. But it's just a theme that runs through everything, I guess, or should, in terms of awareness. So that's the balancing energy security. The next one then around generative AI. I can't think why, but a story popped up this morning on my feed around Scarlett Johansson and suing someone around sort of apparently her voice was being used to provide an AI voice. Anyway, there you go. But in terms of what this looks like, there's so much, again, it all feels all the way up here. What did it mean for someone like me in a relatively small team is there's some really smart people who outside of work were using ChatGPT daily, who came into work in a government space and were told, you can't use AI here, you'll release all our secrets to China. No, we just want to use that because we do external scanning and it's a much more efficient way to actually do it. No, you can't do that. Actually, you can. Once you actually look at what Queensland government does, a number of agencies use it. So over the last month, we've agreed in TIQ that we're now transitioning from a partnership-based scanning model, which is very expensive, into one that we are now doing through the same two people with no additional partnerships or sponsorships. So that's a direct saving to how we operate. Now, again, in terms of the positions that people are in the room here, the key thing for TIQ and how we've agreed to use AI is we're doing it in stages. The first stage, and I've kind of gone, everyone just calm down. We're not releasing anything. We're just building our own sort of LLM, large language model. I sound like I know what I'm talking about, to pick out those key things that we want. So for a commissioner in North America, Vicky now gets every morning, these are the key sectors that she's interested in. She wants to know what's happening from Queensland government, and she wants to know what's happening at the Australia level. So she gets a short email. It's a bit crude at the moment, but we've only been doing it for a couple of weeks. But that gives her, so overnight, for example, I was like, just tell me it picked up this thing around critical minerals. And it did. So I was like, okay, great. So we can then feed that in. And even over 2 weeks, you can see it becoming more accurate. That's not someone else doing that. We've actually stopped how we were working to build that capability for ourselves as a team. So we've made the decision that we're not going to rent someone else's house. We'll come on to cost of living as well. We're going to build this ourselves. And we've had to make choices about what that looks like and how we deploy our staff. Because again, at a real sort of micro level, albeit within a bigger beast, we're quite small. How are people here using AI? What are your experiences and what are the opportunities that you've seen from it? Anyone use it outside of work? Yeah. Because our team do all the coding from the keywords that we put in. Where we want to get to then is to build our own metadata through our CRM and then put our own AI tool into that. So then we can link the external to the internal. Not there yet, but that's kind of so we could then take the external trade data and put it alongside our clients. So that's where it gets a little bit more tricky. So that's
useful for putting together just a research.
Yeah.
But that's a pretty basic one.
Pretty basic, yeah.
Been really useful, pretty time saving.
Yeah, and again, you put human at the center of it, make sure that it makes sense.
Yeah.
From what we come outside of the workshop, and we find that really, really interesting, even on youth-led projects that we're working on. And I'm thinking the other thing we did just playing around was we built our own GPT around circular economy and matching small business requirements to potential future partners.
That sounds really interesting. Yeah. Yes, and so I guess across the room, I think that's great. So we're all beginning to dip our toes in the various different experiences, but I think again, part of me again comes back to that picture of there's just so much data and information out there now. If we don't use these tools to help us make sense of that, how can we give that to people who are incredibly busy at the receiving end?
Actually, that's related to what you were talking about, digitizing information to be exported. I still think, I wonder if people still want to be handheld. I wonder if that's going to give them the information, unless AI steps in and really personalizes it.
Yeah, I think it's a mixture, and I think in terms of understanding where the opportunity lies, I think there's an appetite for people trying to bring that together digitally. What I've also seen when I've done different missions, where it's TIQ and Canada and UK, is when it comes to engaging with a buyer or when we're hosting an investor, that's the value add. That we talk about being a people business. When you've got that connection, that's where we need our great people to be in the room or to be available when, I don't know, mainly, based in just outside Cairns, I think, is the First Nations winner of Australia's first ever export awards done at Queensland. When that firm goes overseas and they know where they land, that there's an office for them to go to, that the buyers that they'll meet as a small business then have been pre-qualified, and there's someone there who understands the market that they operate in, there's real value for human, that's the human piece. And I don't think you ever should replace that bit, but somehow it's like the tip of the spear, isn't it? Like if you look at the US Army, 90% isn't the front line, it's the stuff that supports it. You can always make that more efficient, but it just makes that top even more important for me.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's probably around AI, unless anyone's got any other.
Out of interest, how many councils here use their own CRM, their own data to inform decisions?
Own data, yes, not a CRM.
Yeah, own data then, not a
Yeah.
CRM. Who uses their own data to inform decisions you make around economic development strategy?
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit.
Value.
It's interesting on today. So even ourselves, we're struggling with how to make our own data we gather, and then we just talk to ourselves. Collective. But what we do with it, how we inform our strategy. Right there with you. But yeah, interesting that we rely on ChatGPT and other generative AI, but that's gathering information from across the web, right? So if we're not sharing it data, we're not putting it out there, what's the data sources it's pulling from?
Correct. But you can upload data to it, can't you?
You can. We're not at that stage yet, I'll be honest. That's where probably my CEO would have a minor coronary. But that's where we want to get to. And actually what Queensland government's now got is there's safe, you can put it into like a safe space, we've got to integrate it to our, but that is where we want to get to. In terms of what you said there, so our team provides 2 core products to our EOT every month. We provide an insights update, which looks outside in, and we provide a performance update, which I call looking inside out. And that's about how we then pull out that stuff from the CRM. Like if you look at what we see across Southeast Asia, for example, if you look at Vietnam, 60% of the clients that we've dealt with there to get a first export out clients to TIQ. For Indonesia, that goes down to 18%. Now, I don't realise Vietnam's a new office, so you'd expect some of that. But actually, Singapore, we've had an office for ages, is much closer to 60. The outlier is Indo. So what's happening in Indonesia? Why are we just helping that same pool of clients? Is it the nature of the opportunity, or is it how we're activating that opportunity? How do we then take that forward? So that's the second part of how we're trying to use that CRM data in a slightly more insightful way to coin a phrase, I guess. All right, okay. If I haven't borne everyone down yet, let's look at the World Economic Outlook. You didn't know what you're going to get, did you? But on this bit, and heaven knows what the guy next to me on the plane thought I was doing, but it's unhelpfully, it's the one in the bottom left that is probably the most useful bit, because what that shows is almost a split between what we'd have called, I hate these terms, advanced and developing economies. It just feels a horrendous way to describe things. But what you're seeing there is for the advanced economies, it's about half the projected economic growth than it is for developing economies. Now, one of the key things that we provide then, and we'll come on to what we export to where, but some of our key, and what we're also seeing, sorry, the backdrop to this is at a real macro view is that trade environment. Countries who have stronger relationships with countries are trading more and more together. It used to be dictated by geography. What we're seeing now is that political alignment and relationships are driving trade again. It's a bit of a change. Similarly, in terms of foreign investment, that values base becomes even more important. Why is that important? A lot of our investment comes from existing relationships, perhaps from the US, it comes from UK, Europe, where the economic projections, frankly, are not great. If you compare that to, say, Southeast Asia, where what they're seeing there is over double, we're seeing an economic opportunity that doesn't necessarily match some of those long-standing relationships and routes of particularly investment here. That's where we've come at this space. So what does that look like for TIQ? Well, one of the things we're trying to help people with is if you get a document, some people may have heard of the Invested in Southeast Asia, the Commonwealth Government strategy to Southeast Asia, which I'm presuming is under. How do you take that down to business and actually explain it? Well, part of it for us then is actually as an executive group is, well, actually, we now need to prioritize our investment networks into Southeast Asia. We need to begin to build those same relationships that we've got, not move away from the US or Europe. But a lot of the investment now, a third of the foreign investment coming into Queensland relates to renewable energy. A lot of the end use from that is probably actually going to be in Southeast Asia, not necessarily UK, Europe. That's more the technology. So how we then take this alongside some of that CRM data, just to not to challenge, but to try and improve where our footprint is and the services that we can then offer our clients. So that's one of the more longer term ways that we kind of use some of this insight piece. But in terms of what that sort of shows there, any sort of comments or observations? Is that what people would expect to see, given no doubt everybody studies this every night?
Not my space at all, but just a general comment is that discussion about Southeast Asia has been going on for about 25 years. And I wonder why it's not happening.
Yeah, it's mixed. I mean, Queensland's now our trade goods of India, for example, which at a clutches in Southeast Asia by definition of the report, has gone up at a state level by 4 over the last 2 years. So I don't know what the long-term genesis of that. If I was going to be controversial, I'd say we got very, don't want to use, can I say dependent on China? And people would say, take India and other countries and say it's really hard there. Do you know what? It's really hard for China, not just now, but when we started as well. Really painful lessons for businesses to operate in, but they had invested. They built the buying network, or they got the warehousing in, they got that sort of solution in place. And with capacity, it was hard to do that plus another. I think it's probably a confluence of things now with where China's gone politically at home, plus a sort of perhaps changing government here, which is bringing China back on board in a relationship, but a recognition that we cannot put those eggs back into one basket. So I think probably for the first time ever, certainly so from TIQ's perspective, doubled our network in India. We've opened an office in Vietnam. We're now being financially backed, perhaps in a way, to make this more of a reality than we ever have been. So I'm not sure that's a straight answer. That's probably the best I can give. So it's like concrete actions are happening now, yeah. But you're right, it's not a lot of this isn't new, but it just seems to be coming to a head. Sorry. In terms of the projection, trying to think of a way to phrase this, the uncertainty around the election would be a key point. And if you look at the global barriers and trade barriers, and you saw the big spike when, I'm not trying to say what's right or wrong, being blunt, they came up during Trump last time. People are really concerned what a second term would actually do. And if that drives a really nationalistic view, then those outflows begin to actually tap off. Biden, what he has through the IRA, which my old speak from working in customs in Northern Ireland meant something very different. But the Inflation Reduction Act is almost something that hasn't been seen since probably Roosevelt's New Deal in terms of generating internal and industrial capability in America and opportunities that creates. So that's really driving investment, a bit of a competitive threat, being honest, around new energy and critical minerals. That's now being almost, I think they're trying to legislate that, so it can't then be unpicked depending on what happens for the next election. But there's no guarantees. So you could see a huge swing the other way. So that's where those forecasts, very crudely, and I'm not an economist, come from.
Is there much confidence in the economic markets generally? Obviously, we've got that political unrest. There's a lot of speculation, like the gold price is skyrocketing. So there seems to be some speculation that the global market's going to take a big dive some point soon. Are you kind of seeing that in the trends with exports and imports?
I'd say, being honest, we'll come on to the Queensland picture. There's two things that we keep coming back to: is what's happening with commodity prices, because in terms of what we export, that's key. What we're actually seeing, particularly around met coal, particularly with India and some others, so bizarrely, with some of the geopolitical tensions, there has been a there's been a longer lens put on renewable energy. What was a very almost a linear path, you move from resource heavy into renewables, actually you've now got something along the way called energy security. That probably until, frankly, what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, most of that stuff, most of Europe's gas supplies are housed in the Ukraine. So for Germany, like, their priority is, they know where they need to get to, but frankly, at the moment, they need to make sure they can turn the lights on and heat their houses. So there's been another layer that's been put into that conversation. What it also means is there's opportunities for investment in resources that we hadn't necessarily seen. But it also means that some of that, investors were obviously previously expecting happy to get a lower return around renewables. Well, they're not now. So that's a much more competitive landscape. So the renewables area is a challenge for the Queensland Energy and Jobs Plan. What's the other thing? And I had two things in my mind, and I've now forgotten the other thing. So it must have been really important. Covered the renewables. So we've actually probably touched on both of it, just commodities and the investment landscape. They'd be the areas that we focus on. At a practical level from TIQ, what it means is that the importance of our relationships in markets with investors is absolutely key. There isn't a direct correlation, and we'll cover it, from what you see for the overall investment landscape into Australia and what Queensland gets, and sorry, what TIQ deals with. So the focus of the commissioners in that area is absolutely crucial. Hopefully that helps. Anyone else for this? Nope. Excellent. Feel like we've done that one. Happy to go back, but I think we've all probably had enough. How are we doing around time? We're okay. We're almost there, so thank you and keep going. All right, so clearly I didn't read the brief, which said no more than 5 bullets on a page and make it readable. Well, here's about 12. So I was trying to work out how to actually present, because one of the bullets was what actually is the economic picture of Queensland. So one guy who works for me is technically TIQ's chief economist, which sounds grand, but it's a pretty small team. He had a heart attack when I put it like this. He was like, it's far too simplistic. But it kind of does sum it up a bit, and we can go into some of the details in a bit, but I will just cover some of the main things. So in terms of goods, and I don't think anyone will be surprised by any of this, but when you package it all up, sometimes it can be quite interesting, he says. So goods, what does it look like? Well, all of that's true in terms of what's on the slide. What does that really mean? Well, frankly, from a Queensland export base, we export fewer things to fewer countries than any other state. Now, that's economies of scale, great there, because quite often we get huge value from that. In terms of strategic risk, again, that emphasis around diversification, and why do we keep talking about energy? Because frankly, a lot of it is commodities and resources. None of this is news to anybody in the room. And we can go into bar graphs to your heart's content, that break it all down. But frankly, that's the picture. Fewer things to fewer places than any other state. Worth bearing in mind. Within that, 88% of goods exports, so it says itself, coal, LNG, metals and beef. No one here, again, would be surprised by any of that. But a lot of the people that we work with are perhaps a service provider to those industries, or to industries relating to that overseas, or around it. I listened to that amazing the Renew talk before. Where's creative? You look at Gold Coast and the studios that it's got built up around there. Where that other 12% is so critically important to nourish and grow that I feel that's where rooms like this and the work of TIQ really comes in. Don't get me wrong. There's times we've actually stepped in and helped in terms of coal goods to India and Korea. That's fine. Sometimes the Badger government works. But there's a question earlier about who do we help? That's why balancing our support to some of those larger exporters with the service that we offer to the smaller ones is so key, because that 12% and those markets has to grow. Again, in terms of key markets, there's nothing in there that would be a surprise. Now, the bridge to services, and that's 14.8 billion. The key thing there is that, I'll let someone else here do the maths, but 14.8 billion is 8% of Queensland's total exports. So again, you can see that commodity focus. What does that mean? So 8% of Queensland's exports are services. What does that look like in other states? I just want to check that I've written that down the right way. But what I do know is if 92% of Queensland exports relate to goods, sorry, that's the key stat. In New South Wales, that figure is 68%. In Victoria, it's 58%. Don't worry, WA is 97. So there's always someone. And we were over there a couple of weeks back, so we had a great comparison on that one. That was great fun. But it's important then when we talk about our service industry, because that's the value add bit. I'll keep coming back to the links here, the connectivity to flights, airlines, connectivity, students, tourists. They've got to be able to get here, got to be able to keep them. So what then does that service industry look like for Queensland? Frankly, again, I was doing the maths this morning, but it feels like such a long time ago. It's like 80% of it is international education and tourism. Now, what are we seeing now? And again, really interested in the conversations that you're having in these areas. This is where some of those geopolitical things around cost of living really come into play. Because when you look at the migration strategy, what we're seeing around international education is you get this priority around Southeast Asia on one hand. Then what we're seeing is actually visas being issued as being dialed right back. So again, I'm not trying to predate, like if you speak to James Cook or any of those universities, they'd be really open about it. This is a critical risk now, is we don't have the cohort of international students coming through that we've had pre-COVID and since COVID. Why? Because students are being perceived as exacerbating, I'm trying to phrase this the right way so I don't actually get fired, the cost of living crisis. I think I can say that. I think that's fair. And I think during the budget, there's actually a direct commitment now for universities having to provide their own accommodation. So that's where you see like these different drivers begin to come together. And obviously, the university is not a small business, but a lot of service providers to universities would be. And it's also about the international reputation of Queensland. These are reputational based industries. And as you move away or move back, do you value us as a country or not? Damage can be really hard to overcome. So hearing, yeah, I don't think it's too controversial. Tourism, I've talked about the airlines piece. I promise I'm not going to go back to freight. I promise. But the airline piece there, and not just getting them in, it's great to celebrate it, but keeping them in is absolutely critical. People don't want to, we know a lot of people have to go into Sydney and change, we get it. But we want to get people in, or at the very least that they have one international point of entry, because domestic connectivity then can be a bit easier than that. But anyway, so there you go. The service industry for Queensland is heavily dependent on those two key risks and opportunities across both. I've covered the proportionately weak to New South Wales and Victoria. Key markets. Again, this comes back to geopolitical tensions. China and India. Do we value China or not? I hope so, because they're a key two-way trading partner. But again, we can't just put everything in there. India. Queensland, and there's a really great question there about, again, we've been talking about this for ages. We've doubled our resource into India and we're seeing those outcomes. And one of the areas we really prioritised was around international education. Well, now we can't actually leverage the services that we've put in place. What does that mean if you're in market and you're saying how important you are to us as clients and customers to Queensland? So that's the services picture. Again, I might just pause there because I haven't got that much to say on investment that we haven't said already. But in terms of services, any comments around the goods and services picture sort of provided? Probably no huge surprises, but that may not be a bad thing. Yeah.
What is going out? Like for me, I'm based in Melbourne. I fly through Brisbane to go to the Pacific. And there's a lot of opportunity for the domestic to be going out by Brisbane as well versus international coming in. Most of my family are in Canada and they have to come in via Sydney before they even get to Melbourne. But we've recently discovered Air Canada goes to Fiji and Fiji goes to Brisbane. And so I'm just really curious how we talk about the domestic versus the pure international when it comes to tourism dollars and trade.
Yeah, so I'll check that. I'm just frantically now checking the various horrendously detailed graphs that I've got. I think that's external dollar. I think that's international dollar.
Yeah.
In terms of where it is, and the actual basis for how that's calculated when you speak to Tourism Events Queensland, it's not great, but it's the best that we've got. So I'm pretty sure that that is just the international thing. Glad you mentioned the Pacific, and it was really remiss of me not to mention that, because again, when you talk about sort of those wider macro opportunities, well, there's been a lot of talk there about, you know, how do we position Queensland as the gateway to the Pacific? How do we really value that relationship, which isn't just necessarily in terms of trade and investment outcomes. Again, on that one, what TIQ have done now, we've got offices in New Zealand, Fiji, and Samoa. Those last two, I think I can announce that. I'm not sure if I can say Fiji. There's a plan around Fiji that probably is confidence. But so for the first time, again, similar to what you're saying there, Pacific's nothing new for Queensland. We haven't operated there. So we now are. So in terms of availability, again, to push our businesses, they probably won't be aware. We've got Liata, who's just phenomenal in terms of our Pacific ambassador. If you haven't met her or engaged with her, please do. She's like a force of nature. And, you know, she's from the Pacific and she represents really strongly in that area. We didn't have her a year ago. We didn't have the team around it. So we talk about sort of that diversification piece. That's not us moving. Probably for the first time, we've always just had to do redeployment, and we'll continue to do that. What we've seen over the last 18 months is that ability for us to take that step back and actually go, where do we need to grow in some of these markets? So we've now put in resources and capacity that we haven't had before. So thank you.
It's a bit aggressive because Fiji, the Pacific generally is arguably closer than Asia in terms of cost of freight and so forth, and arguably could probably provide an import source for a lot of our Queensland businesses for certain suppliers as well.
Yeah, I guess it's also where that Austrade are very strong, particularly in New Zealand. And again, the kind of mantra is if you want to export, learn to New Zealand. It's probably a little bit more finesse than that, but you know, you need to be much better than that. But they are very strong there. So I think it's okay for the state agency to go, do you know what? We can actually work through Austrade. Like, we can't be everywhere. We don't have the scale that they do. But I think the mature approach has been, do you know what? We do need some representation there. So we've kind of done that. But actually, I really like the idea that we've gone to some of those other Pacific countries as well to begin to work out how we can. You look at some of the great companies that do work there around marine or areas such as that. So I think it's a relatively balanced approach. Okay. All right. In terms of a big finish, can't do it without talking about the budget. I hope everyone did get that coffee earlier. Look, again, I'm trying to hit the brief and do it in a sort of a relatively light-hearted way, because this really can be a bit of a slog. So I hope it's landing okay. But from my perspective, and one of my team went to hear a speech from Jim Chalmers, isn't it? And he kind of thumbed it up in terms of relief. And again, that's where that cost of living thing comes in. So I deliberately put this at the end, because I think if you start with the budget, you can get all the way up here. And honestly, after probably the third bit of sermon, we'd all have been asleep. But it's important to put that into what does that actually mean? What we're seeing now is policy decisions being made on the basis of things which is right to address the cost of living. But there is a consequence when it comes to trade and investment as well. These things are all joined. The wiggly lines, what I found out is if you Google restraints on a work computer, it doesn't go very well. So that's supposed to stand for restraints. The images were slightly different to what I was expecting. I'll be honest. One little chat with the IT team, just to let them know that bit out of character. But anyway, all educational. So part of that is around the fact that it's not just about what we do now, but it's trying to put us in a better place, of, you know, the chance would say for the future. So that's sort of the restraint bit. And then the last bit is the reform piece. Why is that necessary? Again, in terms of the small businesses that we've got, and we talked about that link to 1 in 10 jobs being supported through foreign investment. Well, actually, the budget announced, and it was linked to Made in Australia, which could be seen to be just about renewables. There's actually a really significant review happening of foreign investment and the streamlining of processes and support for that into Australia, which was announced through the budget. So that's probably the key bit in terms of the reform. Obviously, it's not all in place now, but what we're seeing as TIQ is we talk about seeking foreign investment for some of these key renewables projects. Actually, getting it through these processes is a bloody nightmare. Australia is expensive enough. The thing that we compete on for international investment is that we're more transparent and we're consistent in our decision making. We've begun to move away from that, and investors were beginning to notice. This, I think, is a really good point. We'll see how it actually works in practice, but it suggests that feedback, again, if you're talking about human-centered design, that's been picked up, I think, is a step in the right direction. So, again, it seems again like it's way up there, but I think it could be quite impactful, actually. The key issues addressed, again, speak for themselves. The skills, the sort of care economy, housing, infrastructure, migration. Again, we've touched on migration. I've probably said enough there. Made in Australia is probably the closest we'd ever get to an equivalent of the Inflation Reduction Act for the US. It's something that really is quite important, I think, or has the potential to be. And then I guess what I'd say here in terms of our role in TIQ is originally these are some of the core strategies. Like you've got the Southeast Asia thing, you've got Queensland's international education strategy. Should probably have put the Queensland Trade and Investment Strategy up there. Don't tell the comms team. But there's this whole host of things. This is part of the problem again, isn't it? There's these whole host. There's a strategy for everything. How do you boil this down and help people understand it? Well, that's a core part of what the insights team's for. But we do try and position what we do. Like if you take that Southeast Asia thing, and we're talking about going into 5 countries, how do we help Queensland businesses access those? What are those points of actual relevance as opposed to the other 95 pages? So that's kind of a core bit, and that kind of, I think probably thankfully for all, takes us through. Thank you for your patience. This looks like a bit of a bolted on slide, and I realized that I'd accidentally deleted it, so I frantically put it back in earlier. A bit ironic, I guess, in terms of the core theme of it. But I described it in a slightly different way on the fly. So it's O and then something else. But the actions here, and it's not for me to, I've never pretend to dictate. That's not the role at all. But I always kind of put them in as not actions, but kind of points or pleas or whatever. The supply chain point, I'm not going to go around it again. I think that's probably come across, and understanding it and having those conversations. Utilising the networks, I'm not actually, it's great. We're not asking for anything. We're not asking for support, financial contributions. Actually, what we're saying is just engage with us through our regional networks, connect with us. Hopefully we can send through some of the insight things that we do, and some of that will be of relevance and impact for you. And then think about your own capacity. Doesn't matter which organisation we're in, but I've tried to be quite open in terms of the journey that my teams have been on, how we've begun to engage with things around AI to drive our efficiency. One of the jobs that I worked in a startup, there's only 3 of us there. So if we didn't do it, no one did it. So I always kind of think of it like it's our money. So we should run government teams the same way. And that emphasis on efficiency is really important for me. And I guess that point around 97% of businesses are small. So those conversations around capacity and having an honest conversation that, the markets that people seek to gravitate to, we've really got to help get that right, because you can't just jump from one to the other. These decisions can be multi-generational for a business. So how we help that sort of decision making and investment is absolutely critical. So that capacity building point for me is key. So that was kind of it from me, probably giving everybody about 10 minutes back, which is not a bad thing. But has anybody got any other comments or questions in terms of ground covered? No? Great, I'll hand back. Brilliant. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Daniel. Oh, there's more. But wait. I'll keep going. I'll leave it on a pretty colourful sign. Oh, boy. Everyone's staying here tonight, right? Play with that in a minute. Thank you. Wow. A lot of data, right? A lot of information to absorb straight after lunch too. I think the key, though, is that it's important to understand this because it puts what we do into context. And I think we forget way too often that small businesses are reliant on everything else up the food chain. So a small business can't exist if the slightly larger business isn't doing something else that's either attracting someone to live in that community or buying a product from them. And the big business needs those medium businesses, right? So think about it from an ecosystem perspective. So if these businesses are driving import and export and or attracting investment, so that great little startup in the back of Barcaldine or Burke or wherever might be attracting that investment piece. And that investor then brings some others who start looking at the town next door or down the road. Prime example with real estate, of course, but yeah, how do we broaden that scope to be beyond those kind of couple of core markets you pointed out of real estate, mining, and can't remember the other one. There were three key ones. But yeah, thinking beyond your small businesses themselves to, well, okay, but they're the suppliers or the supporters for the next layer. So keep coming back to cake today. I don't know why, but yeah, layers, right? So takeaway for us, talking about using our data. So, you know, can you justify what you're collecting, and yeah, are you doing something with it? So I think that's really important to understand, you know, why are you actually asking that question? Are there 4 others that you're not asking because you think you're getting stuff, but then you're not doing anything with it? So have a look at your own data, how you can use that, or can you start sharing it as a council? So that's really, really important to start thinking about. The more data we get out there, the better people are informed about what we're doing. The 5 key issues, very interesting there. So you talked about uncertain global economy, geopolitical conflict, supply chain trade disruption, energy security, generative AI. I heard change in all of that. And what we know from our own mindset report we released just last week is small businesses want stability. So on us as government, state and local, how do we create stability in a dynamic changing market? So what can you do to take some of those roadblocks out of the way to provide that nice, consistent backbone for your local small businesses? So I thought that was really key. Improving the digital literacy of your crew, I think applies to all of us in this room, us included. How do we improve the digital literacy of our teams to actually provide some exemplars to small business, rather than going out and saying, oh, you should digitize, and here's your paper form to apply for your license. So yeah, so using digitization where it's easy and it's relevant, rather than trying to just bring it in for everything. So do we need an AI bot to, you know, do a particular thing? Most cases, probably not. Where can we leverage that to actually get rid of some of that administrative process? You know, the example you gave, Daniel, about maybe the person's still really important at the front end of the TIQ interaction, and then they say, go away and here's our tool, go away and plug that in, and we'll circle back to you in a couple of weeks once you've used the tool, and we'll check in and we'll support the bits that you didn't get. But I think that human interaction at the start and that feedback loop's really important. And I think the last one for me was the 3 markets there: commodities, services, and what was the last one? Investment. Yes. So commodities, services, and investment. What can we turn around probably more rapidly? It's not commodities really. That requires you to build a whole economy and a trade sector and that. But you know, services and investment is probably a lot easier for you to turn around in the short term. That's easy to say standing up here, but in the grand scheme of things, right, of those 3 options, they're probably the 2 easier ones to focus on at a local government level. So how can you attract people to your community? You know, we've got you know, the dark net and all that kind of stuff, trying to drive those opportunities to commercialise service provision at a remote location by making it easier to transfer data in particular. So yeah, I thought that was really informative, and yeah, plenty of challenges in there, I think. But for me, the takeaway was, how do we support small businesses in a really hyper change environment? And I think that's by providing a nice stable backbone platform for them to jump off. Cool, thank you, Daniel. All right, we were a bit ahead. I think I've just chewed all the time up. Sorry. So afternoon tea now, please. Thanks for joining us online for that insights session. Try and come back around about 3 o'clock, please. And we'll be kicking off our final workshop for the day, which is our streamlining workshop with Len Cosver. So thank you very much. Afternoon tea.